Did you know that during the Second World War, the average American family was asked to reduce its food consumption by about 15%? Or that in Britain, importing food became so dangerous that the government insured the life of every merchant sailor for £1,000. This wasn't just a war fought on battlefields. It was a war fought in every kitchen, on every dinner plate. This food became a weapon. Saving bacon grease was a patriotic act. A vegetable garden was a fortress. How did ordinary people feed their families when sugar, butter, meat, and cheese were strictly rationed? They didn't have celebrity chefs or internet hacks. They had government pamphlets, community cookbooks, and a whole lot of ingenuity. They made pies without apples and cakes without eggs. They found ways to make a tiny piece of meat feel like a feast. They learned that a nation's strength could be measured in ounces of flour and tablespoons of oil. What can these faded, often strange, recipes teach us about survival, community, and what we truly need to live? Can a chocolate cake made with mayonnaise really be any good? Let's look at what they ate. Number 22, can deception taste delicious? The recipe is for mock apple pie. It's one of the most famous recipes from the era, and it contains no apples. Not a single one. Instead, the filling is made from Ritz crackers. You take a pile of crackers, break them up, and cook them in a syrup of water, sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar. You pour this mush into a pie crust, sprinkle it with cinnamon, and bake it. People swore it tasted just like the real thing. But how? It's a trick played on the brain. The texture of the softened crackers mimics cooked apples. The lemon juice provides the tartness, the sugar provides the sweetness, and the cinnamon is the key. Our sense of smell is powerfully linked to our perception of taste. The scent of cinnamon screams apple pie to our brains, so our brains fill in the blanks. It's a culinary placebo. This recipe didn't just appear out of nowhere. The concept of mock foods or foods designed to imitate more expensive or unavailable ingredients has a long history. But the war made it a household necessity. Nabisco, the company that makes Ritz crackers, promoted the recipe heavily. Their 1943 ad campaigns presented it as a patriotic solution for housewives. The science behind this is fascinating. And Dr. Charles Spence, a professor of experimental psychology at Oxford University, has spent his career studying how our senses interact to create the experience of flavor. His research shows that what we see, hear, and smell can dramatically alter what we taste. The mock apple pie is a perfect example of this. You see a pie, you smell cinnamon, you expect apple, so you taste apple. The government understood this psychology. Propaganda, posters, and radio shows didn't just give you recipes, they built a narrative around them. They framed sacrifice as victory. They made a cracker pie feel like a clever triumph over hardship. The United States Office of War Information, established in 1942, was a master at this. They used every medium available to shape public perception and encourage compliance with rationing. The success of mock apple pie wasn't just about the recipe itself, it was about the story people told themselves while eating it. At the end of it all, we have to ask ourselves some things. How many of the foods we eat today rely on similar sensory tricks, using artificial flavors and scents to mimic real ingredients? If the packaging and marketing were stripped away, would we still enjoy our favorite snacks? What does it say about our food system that a cracker and some syrup could so easily replace a piece of fruit, and no one was the wiser? Number 21. Can a vegetable pie unify a nation? This is the story of the Woolton Pie. It is perhaps the most famous dish of the British home front. It was not born in a home kitchen. It was created at the Savoy Hotel in London in 1941. Frederick Marquis, the first Earl of Woolton, was the Minister of Food. He was a former department store manager, and he knew how to sell an idea. His job was to keep Britain from starving. When German U-boats were sinking supply ships in the Atlantic, imports of food had been cut by more than half. Lord Woolton's strategy was twofold: control the food supply with strict rationing and convince the public to eat what was available. And what was available? Vegetables, especially root vegetables that could be grown at home. The Dig for Victory campaign had turned parks, lawns, and flower beds into vegetable patches. So Lord Woolton needed a recipe, a hearty, nutritious, and most importantly, patriotic dish that used these homegrown vegetables. He tasked the chefs at the Savoy with its creation. The result was the Woolton Pie. The recipe was simple. You dice and boil potatoes, cauliflower, carrots, and turnips. You save the cooking water, you make a thick gravy with the vegetable water and some oatmeal or flour. You mix it all together, maybe add some chopped parsley and put it in a pie dish. The topping was key. It was a pastry made from wholemeal flour or a simple topping of mashed potatoes. No meat, no expensive fats. Just vegetables from the garden. The Ministry of Food promoted it everywhere, on the radio, in newspapers, in pamphlets. It was served in workplace canteens and British restaurants, which were communal kitchens set up to provide cheap, hot meals. But the public reaction was mixed. Some people hated it. They called it a boring mash of vegetables. They missed their meat. The pie became a symbol of the blandness and hardship of the war. Others embraced it as a symbol of resilience. It was a sign that they were all in it together and making do. The food historian Dr. Bryce Evans, in his book Feeding the People in Wartime Britain, argues that the Woolton Pie's importance was more symbolic than culinary. It represented the government's attempt to create a nutritional democracy where everyone, rich or poor, had access to a baseline of healthy food. It didn't matter if you loved it or hated it, you ate it. So some final questions remain. Could a government today successfully promote a national dish to encourage healthier or more sustainable eating habits? Why did the Woolton Pie, despite being nutritious and cheap, completely disappear after the war? Does a food need to be delicious to be important, or can its value lie in the message it sends? Well, number 20, what happens when you bake without the basics? Imagine you want to bake a cake, you go to your pantry, there are no eggs, there is no butter, there is no milk. What do? During the war, you made a wacky cake, or a crazy cake, or a war cake. It had many names, but the principle was the same. It was a cake born of pure chemistry and desperation. This recipe actually predates the war, with roots in the Great Depression, but it was perfected and popularized when rationing hit hard. Here's how it worked. You mix the dry ingredients directly in the baking pan. Flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and salt. You make 3 wells in the dry mix. In one, you pour vegetable oil. In another, you pour vinegar. In the third, you pour vanilla extract. And then you pour cold water over the whole thing, mix it with a fork until it's just combined, and stick it in the oven. No mixing bowls to wash, no eggs to crack, no butter to cream. It seems like it shouldn't work. It seems like a mistake. But it produces a surprisingly moist and rich chocolate cake. The magic is in the reaction between the vinegar and the baking soda. Vinegar is an acid. Baking soda is a base. When they are mixed in a wet environment, they create a chemical reaction that releases carbon dioxide gas. Those bubbles of gas are what make the cake rise and give it a light texture. It's the same reaction that makes a science fair volcano erupt. The oil replaces the butter for fat and moisture. The water replaces the milk. It's a brilliant piece of kitchen science. Home economists working for government agencies like the U.S. Bureau of Home Economics were instrumental in developing and distributing recipes like this. Women like Eleanor Roosevelt championed this kind of thrift and ingenuity in her My Day newspaper column, often sharing tips and simple recipes. These weren't just about making dessert, they were about maintaining a sense of normalcy and morale. A simple cake could be a powerful comfort in uncertain times. In her book, A Square Meal, food historian Jane Ziegelman explains that such recipes were a psychological lifeline. They prove that even when deprived of basics, American creativity could still produce a treat. And yet, some things are left to wonder. Are we too reliant on a specific set of essential ingredients today, like eggs and butter, when simple chemistry can provide alternatives? How many other basic scientific principles from the kitchen have we forgotten in our era of pre-made mixes and convenience foods? Was the wacky cake truly a treat, or was it a constant, edible reminder of everything that was missing? Number 19, can a potato double as an apple and a pastry? The potato was the undisputed hero of the wartime kitchen. It was easy to grow, filling, and incredibly versatile. The British Ministry of Food even created a character called Potato Pete to sing songs and encourage people to eat more potatoes. He was the cheerful face of a national survival strategy, but the ways they used potatoes went far beyond simply boiling or mashing them. The potato was a master of disguise. 2 recipes show this perfectly. The first is potato pastry. Fats like butter and lard were severely rationed, often just a few ounces per person per week. Making a traditional pie crust was nearly impossible. The solution was to add cold, mashed potato to the flour. The potato adds moisture and starch, which helps bind the dough together. This meant you could use significantly less fat and still get a workable pastry. It wasn't flaky and light like a butter pastry. It was softer, a bit denser, but it did the job. It could top a Woolton Pie or encase a meager meat filling. The second recipe is even stranger, mock apricot tart. This one follows the same logic as the mock apple pie. You take a cooked, mashed potato and mix it with a little sugar and a few drops of almond extract. Almond extract contains benzaldehyde, a chemical compound that is a key flavor component in apricots, peaches, and cherries. The potato provides the texture and bulk, while the almond extract provides the apricot flavor. It was another trick of the senses, a way to create the ghost of a summer fruit in the middle of a bleak winter. These recipes were a testament to the work of food scientists and home economists who were desperately trying to solve nutritional and logistical problems. The British Ministry of Food Scientific Advisors Division, led by the brilliant biochemist Jack Drummond, worked tirelessly to find ways to fortify foods and create nutritious alternatives from the limited ingredients available. They were the unsung heroes of the home front, turning chemical compounds and nutritional data into edible realities. This leaves us with some unsettling questions. How much of our modern food is also a master of disguise, using chemical flavorings to imitate something it is not? We praise the potato for its versatility, but at what point does forcing one ingredient to be so many different things become a sign of a broken food system? And if you ate a pie made of potato pastry filled with potato apricots, were you enjoying a clever treat or just eating a plate of lies? Number 18, is it still meatloaf if it's mostly oatmeal? This meat was one of the most desired and most heavily rationed items. In the US, the ration was about 28 ounces per person per week, but that included all kinds of cuts, many of which were tough or bony. In Britain, the ration was even smaller, sometimes as little as the equivalent of 2 small chops. Getting the most out of every scrap of meat was essential. This led to the rise of the meat extender. The goal was to take a small amount of ground meat and stretch it to feed a whole family. The wartime meatloaf is the perfect example. A typical recipe might start with half a pound of ground beef or pork. To this, you would add a cup or more of breadcrumbs, cracker crumbs, or most commonly rolled oats. You would also add grated vegetables like carrots or onions, and maybe a little bit of the water you boiled the vegetables in for moisture. You'd season it heavily because the fillers would dilute the flavor and then bake it as usual. The result was a loaf that looked like a meatloaf and could be sliced like a meatloaf, but was in fact mostly grain and vegetables. It was a common joke that the meat was just there to hold the oatmeal together. This wasn't just about saving money or rations. It was promoted as a nutritional strategy. Government pamphlets like the American Thrifty Use of Foods in Wartime, published by the Bureau of Human Nutrition and Home Economics in 1943, explained that adding whole grains and vegetables made the meal healthier and more balanced. It was a way to sneak extra nutrients onto the plate. Clara Gebhard Snyder, a prominent home economist for the Wheat Flour Institute, was a key figure in promoting the use of grains as extenders. She developed and tested countless recipes designed to make rations go further while still providing adequate nutrition. The message was clear: this wasn't deprivation, it was smart cooking. But the questions linger. We see meat extenders in our food today, from soy protein in burgers to breadcrumbs and sausages, but we see them as cheap fillers, not nutritional enhancements. When did our perception of this practice change from clever to corrupt? How much meat does a dish need to contain before we can no longer honestly call it a meat dish? And was the wartime housewife who served her family a loaf of seasoned oatmeal tricking them or saving them? Number 17, can you make candy from a vegetable? A world with almost no sugar is hard for us to imagine. Today it's in everything, but during the war, the sugar ration was severe. In Britain, it was just 8 ounces a week. In the US, it was about the same. This meant cakes, cookies, and candy were rare luxuries. But the craving for something sweet never went away, especially for children. So people got creative. They turned to the natural sweetness found in vegetables. Enter carrot fudge. It sounds strange, but carrots are naturally quite sweet, especially when cooked. The recipe involved grating a large amount of carrots and boiling them until they were a soft, thick pulp. Then, you would add your tiny sugar ration, a bit of spice like ginger or nutmeg, and maybe some gelatin or cornstarch to help it set. You'd cook it down until it was very thick, pour it into a greased pan, and let it cool. It didn't have the creamy, melty texture of real fudge. It was denser, more like a firm jelly, and it definitely tasted of carrots, but it was sweet and it was a treat. Another popular vegetable candy was potato candy. This one was even simpler. You would take a small boiled potato and mash it until it was perfectly smooth. Then you would add a large amount of powdered sugar, a little at a time, kneading it until you had a smooth, pliable dough, almost like marzipan. You could roll it out, spread it with peanut butter, roll it up into a log, and slice it. The potato was completely tasteless, it just provided a starchy, smooth base for the sugar and peanut butter. It was a way to stretch a small amount of sugar into a much larger batch of candy. These recipes were shared in women's magazines and on radio programs like the BBC's The Kitchen Front, hosted by the character of the Food Flash. These programs were a vital source of information and morale, offering daily tips on how to cope with rationing. The book Victory in the Kitchen, The Life of Churchill's Cook by Annie Gray sheds light on how even at the highest levels of government, finding ways to create satisfying meals within the ration was a constant challenge. This forces us to think. We are currently told to eat less sugar for our health. The war forced a low-sugar diet out of necessity. Did this forced reduction have any long-term, unstudied health benefits for the population? What other vegetables sitting in our refrigerators right now have the potential to be turned into dessert if we just thought about them differently? And is a fudge made of carrots an honest treat or a sad reminder of the real thing? Number 16, can weeds and scraps become a meal? Nothing was wasted. That was the central rule of the wartime kitchen. Every peel, every bone, every leftover scrap of food had a use. Throwing food away was not just wasteful, it was seen as deeply unpatriotic. This mindset led to the creation of dishes that seem shocking to us today. Take nettle soup. Nettles are a common weed, known for their painful sting. But when cooked, the sting disappears, and they have a flavor similar to spinach, and they are packed with vitamins. Foraging for wild greens became a common practice. A typical recipe for nettle soup involved carefully gathering young nettle leaves using gloves, of course, washing them, and boiling them in water or a thin broth with a potato and an onion. You would then puree the soup until it was smooth. It was a green, healthy, and, most importantly, free soup. The Ministry of Food published pamphlets on foraging, like Hedgerow Harvest, which identified edible wild plants. This was a revival of ancient knowledge that had been largely forgotten with the rise of industrial agriculture. Another recipe born of this waste not philosophy was potato peel crisps. Instead of throwing away potato peels, you would wash them, toss them with a tiny amount of oil or bacon grease and salt, and bake them in the oven until they were crisp. They were a savory, crunchy snack made from something that would otherwise go straight into the compost bin. This idea of using every part of the vegetable was a core tenet of the wartime kitchen. It was part of a larger conservation effort. Cities set up pig bins on street corners where people could dump their organic food scraps. These scraps were collected and boiled down to create swill to feed pigs, which in turn would become part of the food supply. According to the Imperial War Museum archives, this scheme produced enough feed for hundreds of thousands of pigs. So, what are we to make of this? We live in an era of staggering food waste, where up to 40% of food is thrown away. What specific economic and cultural shifts caused us to lose this deep-seated instinct to use every scrap? How many edible weeds are growing in our own backyards and parks that we are completely unaware of? And if we were forced to eat nettle soup and potato peels, would it be a sign of our resilience or a sign that our entire food system had failed? Number 15, what does freedom taste like in a cup? Coffee was a major part of American life, but the war disrupted shipping routes. The ships that once brought coffee beans from South America were now needed for troops and supplies, or they were targets for submarines. In 1942, coffee was rationed. Each person was allowed 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks, which was not nearly enough for most daily drinkers. This created a problem of both caffeine withdrawal and a disruption of a comforting daily ritual. The solution for many was chicory. The roasted and ground root of the chicory plant had been used as a coffee substitute or extender for centuries, especially in France. It contains no caffeine, but it brews into a dark, intensely flavored beverage that has a similar bitterness and body to coffee. Whole companies like Camp Coffee, a brand of coffee and chicory essence from the UK, saw a huge surge in popularity. But many people brewed pure chicory. They would mix a little of their precious real coffee ration with a lot of chicory to make it last longer. The taste was something you had to get used to. It was more bitter, with an earthy, almost burnt flavor. And for many, it was a constant, disappointing reminder that they weren't drinking real coffee. This wasn't just about a beverage. Coffee breaks were a huge part of factory morale. The government understood this. The Pan American Coffee Bureau, an industry group, worked with the Office of War Information on campaigns with slogans like "Make it do, make it last." They provided instructions on how to brew coffee carefully to get the most out of every bean. The historian Mark Pendergrass, in his book Uncommon, grounds the history of coffee and how it transformed our world, details how the coffee industry and the government collaborated to manage the shortage without causing a complete collapse in public morale. It was a delicate balancing act between conservation and comfort. For soldiers on the front lines, coffee was even more important. It was a taste of home and a vital stimulant. The military made sure that troops had access to real coffee whenever possible, often in the form of early instant coffee products. This whole episode leaves behind some interesting questions. How much of our attachment to drinks, like coffee, is about the chemical caffeine, and how much is about the ritual and comfort of a hot, familiar beverage? If our global supply chains for coffee, tea, or chocolate were suddenly cut off, what would we use as substitutes, and how would that change our daily culture? Was the widespread acceptance of chicory a sign of adaptability, or was it a form of mass delusion, pretending something was coffee when it clearly wasn't? Number 14, can you make mayonnaise without the main ingredient? Mayonnaise is an emulsion. It's made by suspending tiny droplets of oil in a liquid, usually a mixture of egg yolk and vinegar or lemon juice. The egg yolk is the key. It contains lecithin, a natural emulsifier that keeps the oil and vinegar from separating. But during the war, both eggs and oil were rationed. A weekly egg ration in Britain was often one single egg per person, sometimes less. Making real mayonnaise was out of the question, so they invented eggless mayonnaise. It was another marvel of kitchen chemistry. There were a few different methods. One popular recipe used a thick white sauce as a base. You would make a paste of flour and water or milk, cook it until it was thick, and then let it cool. This starchy, thick mixture would act as the emulsifier, trapping the oil droplets. You would then slowly whisk in your ration of oil, along with vinegar, mustard, and salt for flavor. Another version used mashed potato, or even a simple can of evaporated milk, whisked with vinegar and oil. The results were surprisingly effective. The texture was creamy, and the flavor was close enough to the real thing, especially when mixed into a potato salad or used as a sandwich spread. These recipes were a direct response to the scientific understanding of food that was being promoted by government agencies. Pamphlets from the Ministry of Food and the U.S. Department of Agriculture didn't just give instructions, they often explained the why behind the recipe. They taught a generation of home cooks the principles of emulsification, leavening, and nutrition. They were, in effect, mass-market science lessons. As food historian Rachel Lawton points out in her work, major wars often accelerate technological and scientific innovation, and this extends right into the domestic kitchen. The need to substitute and innovate forced a deeper understanding of how ingredients function on a chemical level. The housewife became a sort of practical chemist, but this raises some questions for us. Many commercially produced mayonnaises and salad dressings on our shelves today contain starches, gums, and other stabilizers instead of relying solely on egg. Have we just permanently adopted a rationing version of mayonnaise without even realizing it? At what point does a substitute stop being a substitute and become a new thing entirely? And does the fact that we could so easily replace the central ingredient of a classic sauce reveal something fundamental about what we consider real food? Number 13, how do you turn a single sausage into a family meal? The sausage was a versatile food during the war, but the quality changed dramatically. With meat being so scarce, the government set regulations on how much meat a sausage had to contain. This rusk, or breadcrumb filler, content went up and up. By 1942, British sausages often contained so much water and bread that they were known to explode when fried. Despite this, they were a valuable source of flavor and protein. The challenge was how to use one or two sausages to feed a whole family. And the answer was dishes, like the sausage and potato casserole. The recipe was more of a template than a strict set of rules. You would take your 2 rationed sausages and slice them into thin rounds. You would then thinly slice several potatoes and an onion. In a casserole dish, you would create layers, a layer of potatoes and onions, a few slices of sausage, another layer of potatoes, and so on. You would pour a thin gravy made from vegetable water and a stock cube over the whole thing and bake it for a long time in a slow oven. The long, slow cooking allowed the flavor from the small amount of sausage to permeate the entire dish. The potatoes became soft and savory, and the whole thing was a hot filling, one-pot meal. This was the art of flavor management. Cooks learned how to use a small amount of a powerfully flavored ingredient like sausage, bacon, or a chunk of cheese to lift an entire dish made of bland, plentiful ingredients like potatoes and flour. Lord Woolton's Ministry of Food actively encouraged this. They ran campaigns on using herbs from the garden and making savory gravies to make vegetable dishes more appealing. This was a direct counterattack against the perceived blandness of the wartime diet. The book The Flavor of the 1940s by Marguerite Patton, a home economist who worked for the ministry during the war, is filled with hundreds of such tips and tricks. She became one of the most trusted voices on the radio, guiding millions of women through the daily challenges of the ration book. This technique of flavor management leaves us with some critical thoughts. Modern cooking, especially with processed foods, often relies on overwhelming amounts of salt, sugar, and artificial flavors. Have we lost the subtle art of using small amounts of real ingredients to create deep, layered flavor? Could the principles of the sausage and potato casserole, using a little meat to flavor a lot of vegetables, be a model for a more sustainable and healthier way of eating today? Or was it just a way to disguise the fact that there simply wasn't enough food to go around? Number 12. Can a sandwich survive without butter or meat? The sandwich is a staple lunch, but its two main components, the filling and the spread, were heavily rationed. Meat was scarce, and the butter ration was just 2 ounces a week, barely enough for a few pieces of toast. Cheese was also heavily rationed. This meant the classic meat and cheese sandwich with butter was a rare treat. The lunchtime sandwich had to be reinvented. The solution was the victory spread. This was not one specific recipe, but a whole category of vegetable-based sandwich fillings. They were designed to be flavorful, nutritious, and most importantly made from unrationed ingredients. A common recipe for a savory spread might involve grating a raw carrot and mixing it with a bit of mashed potato for bulk, and a tiny bit of chopped onion for flavor. You'd season it with salt, pepper, and maybe some parsley from the garden. For a sweeter version, you could mix grated carrot with a few chopped raisins. Another popular spread used mashed lentils or beans, seasoned with herbs, to create a sort of mock pate. These spreads were often used on the national loaf, a brownish wholemeal bread mandated by the British government. It was dense and nutritious, but many people found it coarse and unappetizing. The victory spread was supposed to make it more palatable. The person most associated with this kind of inventive cooking in America was Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1941, she organized a conference at the White House to discuss nutrition and national defense. She advocated for simple, nutritious meals, and even famously served a lunch of scrambled eggs and mashed potatoes to President Roosevelt to showcase a thrifty meal. She understood that the home front was a real front in the war, and food was its ammunition. Her efforts and those of countless home economists helped to frame this kind of eating not as a deprivation, but as a clever and patriotic duty. The book Food and War in 20th Century Europe by Ines Weiniger-Bargielowska explores how governments across Europe used food as a tool to mobilize populations and enforce social cohesion. The simple sandwich spread was part of this massive social engineering project. But what questions does this raise for us now? We have an almost infinite variety of sandwich fillings available, yet many are highly processed and nutritionally poor. Have we traded the simple vegetable-based thrift of the victory spread for convenience that is ultimately worse for us? If we were suddenly faced with a lack of butter and processed meats, what would we put in our sandwiches? And could a grated carrot and mashed potato sandwich ever be truly satisfying, or is its main ingredient just quiet desperation? Number 11. Could you drink your dessert? With sugar and fat for baking so scarce, traditional desserts were hard to come by. But people still craved a sweet end to a meal. One solution was to drink your dessert. Sweet, milky, and often hot beverages could provide the comfort and sweetness of a pudding without using up precious flour, eggs, or butter. A classic example was the evaporated milkshake. Canned, evaporated milk was more readily available than fresh milk in some areas and was shelf-stable, making it a valuable pantry item. The recipe was simple. You would dilute a can of evaporated milk with water, heat it gently, and sweeten it with a spoonful of your sugar ration, or perhaps some honey or syrup if you had it. A drop of vanilla or a sprinkle of nutmeg would make it feel more like a special treat. It was served hot, almost like a sweet latte or a thin custard. It was warm, comforting, and it hit the sweet spot. Another popular dessert-like drink was homemaker's cocoa, promoted by the Ministry of Food. The recipe used a small amount of cocoa powder, a bit of sugar, and a lot of liquid, often a mix of milk and water, thickened slightly with a pinch of cornstarch to make it feel richer and more substantial. This shift towards liquid desserts was part of a broader nutritional strategy. The government knew that calories were crucial, especially for manual laborers and children. Liquid calories were an efficient way to deliver energy. The development of fortified foods was also part of this effort. In 1942, the British government mandated that white flour be fortified with calcium and B vitamins to prevent nutritional deficiencies. This scientific approach to public health was a hallmark of the era. Sir Jack Drummond, the scientific advisor to the Ministry of Food, was a pivotal figure, using his expertise to ensure the British diet, though monotonous, was nutritionally adequate. His work is credited with making the British population healthier during the war than they had been before it. Reflecting on this, we must ask some challenging questions. We are now often warned against drinking our calories in the form of sugary sodas and juices. How did a practice that was seen as a nutritional solution during the war become a major health problem today? What is the psychological difference between a hot, homemade milk drink and a cold, mass-produced can of soda? And in a world of scarcity, does the form of a calorie matter as much as the calorie itself? Number 10. Can a crumb topping replace a real pie? The traditional British crumble, with its rich, buttery, sugary topping, was a casualty of rationing. There simply wasn't enough butter or sugar to make it, but the desire for a comforting baked fruit pudding remained. The solution was the kitchen front crumble, a recipe that was promoted on the BBC radio show of the same name. The brilliance of the crumble was its adaptability. The fruit base could be anything. You had rhubarb from the garden, a few foraged blackberries, or even the infamous mock apple or mock apricot fillings made from crackers or potatoes. The real innovation was the topping. Instead of a classic crumble mix, the recipe called for using stale bread. You would take leftover crusts and dry pieces of the national loaf, grate them into coarse crumbs, and mix them with a tiny bit of your sugar ration, a dab of margarine, and some spices like cinnamon. You would then sprinkle this over the fruit and bake it. The breadcrumbs would toast and become crunchy, providing a satisfying texture that mimicked a real crumble. It wasn't as rich or as sweet, but it was a hot, comforting dessert made from leftovers. This recipe embodies the make do and mend spirit that was essential for survival. This philosophy didn't just apply to food, it applied to clothes, furniture, and everything else. The government actively promoted it. For example, the utility clothing scheme, introduced in Britain in 1941, produced simple, well-made clothes that were designed to be durable and require minimal materials. The kitchen front crumble was the culinary equivalent of patching a worn-out sock. It was practical, resourceful, and a little bit drab. Marguerite Patton, the BBC kitchen front host, became a national treasure by providing a constant stream of these practical ideas. Her calm, reassuring voice taught a nation how to turn scarcity into sustenance. This ingenuity leaves us with some pointed questions. Our modern food system is built on the idea of perfection and abundance, leading to immense waste when food is cosmetically imperfect or slightly stale. What would it take to revive the make do and mend philosophy in our own kitchens? How did stale bread transform from a valuable ingredient into something we throw away without a second thought? And could we ever truly be satisfied with a dessert whose main selling point is that it uses up old crusts? Number 9 is a salad. Still a salad if it's cooked. The idea of a fresh, crisp green salad is a modern luxury. It relies on refrigeration and rapid transport to get delicate lettuces from the field to the table. During the war, this was often not possible. Furthermore, the British public in particular had a historical suspicion of raw vegetables. The belief that raw foods were harder to digest was still common, so the salad was often a very different dish from what we know today. A typical wartime salad would consist almost entirely of cooked root vegetables. A recipe from a Ministry of Food pamphlet might instruct you to boil potatoes, carrots, and beets separately to avoid everything turning pink. You would then let them cool, chop them into cubes, and dress them with a simple vinaigrette made from vinegar, a little oil, salt, and mustard. Sometimes a few leaves of tough cabbage or a chopped hard-boiled egg might be added. It was served cold, and it was called a salad, but it was essentially a dish of cold, dressed, boiled vegetables. The famous food writer MFK Fisher, writing about food shortages in America in her book How to Cook a Wolf, captured the psychological challenge of making such food appealing. It required not just cooking skill, but an act of imagination to transform humble ingredients into something desirable. The push to eat more vegetables, raw or cooked, was a cornerstone of public health campaigns. In the United States, the U.S. Needs U.S. Strong campaign featured posters and advertisements linking vegetable consumption to patriotism and physical strength. The discovery of vitamins in the preceding decades had created a new scientific understanding of nutrition, and governments were eager to apply this knowledge. They knew that a population well fed on vitamins from vegetables would be healthier and more productive for the war effort. The Victory Garden program, which saw Americans plant over 20 million home gardens, was the practical application of this policy. These gardens produced an estimated 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the U.S. in 1944. Thinking about this today raises some interesting points. We have access to an incredible variety of fresh salad greens year-round, yet vegetable consumption is still lower than recommended. Why has abundance failed to achieve the nutritional goals that scarcity and government propaganda once did? What happened to the regional and seasonal salads made of cooked and preserved vegetables that were once common? And if you put a plate of cold, boiled, dressed carrots in front of someone today and called it a salad, would they eat it or would they see it as a punishment? Number 8, how do you make gravy from water? Gravy is the soul of many British and American meals. It's a rich, savory sauce, traditionally made from the juices of roasted meat, thickened with flour. But what do you do when you rarely have a roast, and even when you do, the meat is so lean there are no juices? And fat for making a roux is rationed. You can't just pour water on your potatoes. You need gravy. Wartime gravy was an exercise in pure invention. The goal was to create a brown, savory, thick liquid using almost nothing. A common method started with the water you had used to boil vegetables. This pot liquor contains some nutrients and a little bit of flavor. To this, you would add a browning agent. This could be a spoonful of dark Marmite or Bovril yeast extracts, popular in Britain, or you could create your own by slowly browning a bit of flour and onion in a dry pan. The most important ingredient was the stock cube. Brands like OXO became indispensable. A single, salty cube could turn a pint of water into something resembling a meat broth. You would dissolve the cube in the hot vegetable water, add your browning, and then thicken the whole mixture with a little flour or cornstarch. The result was a hot, salty, brown sauce that looked and felt like gravy, even if it had never been near a piece of meat. This reliance on industrial food products like stock cubes and yeast extracts is a key part of the wartime food story. These products were scientifically formulated, shelf-stable, and provided a concentrated burst of flavor that was otherwise missing from the diet. As historian Lizzie Collingham describes in her book, The Taste of War, the global conflict accelerated the development and acceptance of processed foods. The needs of feeding armies and civilian populations created a massive market for products that were cheap, long-lasting, and easy to transport. The humble stock cube was a miracle of modern food technology, delivering a savory taste, or umami, that made the endless potatoes and bread more palatable. This leads to some profound questions about our own food. How much of the flavor in the processed foods we eat today comes not from real ingredients, but from modern, sophisticated versions of the stock cube, like yeast extracts, hydrolyzed proteins, and artificial flavorings? Have we become so accustomed to these manufactured flavors that we find the taste of simple, real food to be bland? And was the wartime gravy, made of water and a chemical cube, an ingenious solution or the beginning of our journey away from real food? Number 7. Can a country change its taste in bread? Bread is fundamental. It's the staff of life. But the war threatened Britain's bread supply. Britain imported most of its wheat, primarily from North America. The long journey across the Atlantic was perilous. To conserve shipping space and ensure the population got the most nutrition out of every grain, the government took a drastic step. In 1942, they banned the production of white bread. In its place came the national loaf. The national loaf was made from wholemeal flour of a high extraction rate, meaning more of the bran and germ of the wheat grain was included. This made the bread much richer in vitamins and fiber than white bread. To further boost its nutritional value, the government mandated that calcium carbonate be added to the flour to supplement the diet. The loaf itself was dense, coarse, and grayish-brown. For a population accustomed to soft, white bread, it was a shock. Many people hated it. They found it hard to digest and complained that it tasted like sawdust. It became a symbol of the dreary, monotonous diet. Despite its unpopularity, the national loaf was a public health triumph. The nutritional state of the British people, particularly the poorest, actually improved during the war. Cases of anemia and other deficiency diseases dropped. Lord Woolton and his scientific advisors had correctly identified bread as the single most important vehicle for delivering essential nutrients to the entire population. It was a massive, countrywide public health intervention. The story of the national loaf is a powerful example of how government policy can directly influence the health of a nation. As told in the Social History Archives of Mass Observation, which recorded the everyday lives of ordinary British people, the loaf was a source of constant grumbling, but it was eaten because there was no alternative. It was a forced choice for the greater good. This historical experiment leaves us with some big questions. Today, public health experts advocate for a return to whole grains, but white bread still dominates the market. Why is a choice that is known to be healthier so widely rejected when a less healthy alternative is available? Could a government today ever successfully mandate a change in a staple food for public health reasons, or would it be seen as an unacceptable infringement on personal freedom? And does the fact that the national loaf was abandoned with great celebration the moment the war ended prove that people will always choose pleasure over nutrition when given the choice? Number 6, what does it mean to eat for victory? The concept of eating for victory was not just a catchy slogan, it was a comprehensive strategy to mobilize every citizen in the war effort through their daily food choices. It reframed the act of eating from a private, personal activity into a public, patriotic duty. This was achieved through one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history. In the United States, this was embodied by the Victory Garden. The Department of Agriculture launched the program in 1942. Posters, radio shows, and newsreels encouraged every family, school, and community to plant a garden. Lawns were plowed under and city parks were converted into vegetable plots. The campaign created a direct, tangible link between the home front and the war front. A carrot grown in your backyard was a carrot that didn't need to be shipped, freeing up trains and trucks for war materials. By 1944, an estimated 20 million Victory Gardens were producing nearly 40% of all the fresh vegetables consumed in the country. It was a staggering logistical achievement powered by ordinary people. This wasn't just about food production. It was about morale. A Victory Garden gave people a sense of purpose and contribution. It was something they could do. The recipes that used these vegetables, from simple steamed greens to complex vegetable pies, were called victory recipes. In cooking and eating this food was a constant reminder of their participation in the war. The character of Mrs. Miniver, from the 1942 Oscar-winning film of the same name, became a symbol of this quiet, domestic heroism on the British home front. Her tending of her garden and her calm resilience in the face of hardship inspired millions. The historian William Woys Weaver, in his book Heirloom Vegetable Gardening, documents how this period led to a surge in interest in specific hardy vegetable varieties that were well suited to home gardens. This powerful connection between food and national purpose forces us to ask some fundamental questions. Could we ever again mobilize a national effort around food, not for war, but for challenges like climate change or public health? What have we lost by completely separating the act of food production from the act of food consumption? And was the sense of community and shared purpose generated by the Victory Garden movement a unique product of wartime, or is it something we could recreate today? Number 5, can Spam be a delicacy? Spam, the canned cooked pork product made by Hormel Foods Corporation, became one of the most iconic foods of the Second World War. It was cheap, high in calories and fat, and incredibly durable. It didn't require refrigeration and had a shelf life of years. This made it a perfect food for shipping to troops and to allied nations as part of the Lend-Lease program. Britain, in particular, received enormous quantities of Spam. It became a staple of the national diet. Housewives had to figure out what to do with it. They couldn't afford to be picky. They fried it, baked it, put it in sandwiches, and added it to stews. A popular dish was Spam fritters, where slices of Spam were dipped in a simple flour and water batter and fried. Served with potatoes and gravy, it was a hot, filling meal. Another creation was the Spam hash, where diced Spam was fried up with boiled potatoes and onions. While it was a lifesaver, providing much-needed protein and fat, many people grew to hate it. Its relentless presence on the dinner table for years made it a symbol of the monotony of the wartime diet. The comedian and writer Spike Milligan, who served in the British Army, often joked about the endless meals of Spam. The story of Spam is a story of global logistics. The American government purchased billions of cans of it. The industrial efficiency of American food production, as documented by historians like Harvey Levenstein in Revolution at the Table, was a key factor in the Allied victory. The ability to produce and ship vast quantities of non-perishable food was as important as the ability to produce tanks and planes. The Spam was, in its own way, a weapon of war. It fed armies and it kept civilian populations from starving. Hormel proudly advertised Spam's role in the war, creating a patriotic aura around their canned meat. The legacy of Spam is complex. In some places like Hawaii and parts of Asia, it was integrated into the local cuisine and remains popular to this day. In Britain, it became a joke, a symbol of hardship to be left behind as soon as possible. This brings up some fascinating questions. How does a single food item come to represent both salvation and suffering? What does the global journey of Spam tell us about the long-term cultural impacts of war and international aid? And if our modern food supply chains were to break down, would we see a can of Spam as a disgusting relic or a delicious miracle? Number 4, how did a radio show change how a nation cooks? In the days before the internet or television cooking shows, the radio was the most powerful medium for mass communication. In Britain, the BBC's The Kitchen Front was a daily 15-minute broadcast that became an essential part of life for millions of housewives. It aired right after the morning news and provided recipes, tips, and encouragement for dealing with the challenges of rationing. The show was hosted by a rotating cast of experts, but its most famous voice was Marguerite Patton. She had a calm, practical, and reassuring tone. She didn't just read recipes, she explained the logic behind them. She would tell you why you needed to add mashed potato to your pastry, or how to make a gravy out of vegetable water. The recipes featured were things like Lord Woolton Pie, Homemaker's Cocoa, and the Kitchen Front Crumble. The show was a lifeline. It created a sense of shared experience, letting listeners know that everyone was facing the same problems in their kitchens. It also served as a direct channel for the Ministry of Food to communicate its latest advice and regulations. If a new food was introduced, or if the ration changed, the Kitchen Front would explain what to do. The impact of this single radio show was immense. It standardized a new way of cooking across the country based on thrift, science, and government guidance. Historian Shion Nicholas, in her book The Echo of War, analyzes how the BBC became a central pillar of the British war effort, shaping morale and national identity. The Kitchen Front was a key part of this, turning the kitchen into a site of national service. The show's archive, now held by the BBC, is a rich historical record of the daily struggles and small triumphs of the home front. It's a sonic snapshot of a nation learning to feed itself under immense pressure. This piece of history leaves us with some crucial questions about media and food. What is the modern equivalent of the Kitchen Front? Is it a collection of food blogs, YouTube channels, and TikTok videos? Or have we lost that central, trusted source of culinary information? Could a media campaign today be as effective at changing a nation's eating habits as that simple radio show was? And what does it say about our society that our most popular food media often focuses on extravagant, aspirational cooking rather than the practical, everyday challenges of getting dinner on the table? Number 3, could a sweetener be a poison? The sugar ration was one of the hardest to bear. The craving for sweetness is a powerful human instinct. While some people turn to carrots or potatoes, others turn to a chemical solution, saccharin. Saccharin is an artificial sweetener that was discovered in the late 19th century. It is hundreds of times sweeter than sugar and has no calories, so during the war it became widely available in small tablets. People used it to sweeten their tea and coffee, saving their precious sugar ration for baking. Recipes were even developed for acarine custards and acarine jellies. However, saccharin had its problems. It had a distinct and, for many people, unpleasant metallic aftertaste. It also behaved very differently from sugar in cooking. It couldn't caramelize, and it didn't provide the bulk and texture that sugar did in cakes and biscuits. It was a purely functional sweetness, divorced from all the other properties of sugar. Its use was a constant reminder of the real thing that was missing. The history of saccharin is intertwined with public health debates. For decades, there were concerns that it might be a carcinogen. In the 1970s, studies on lab rats led to proposals for a ban in the United States. The food writer B. Wilson, in her book The Way We Eat Now, discusses how artificial sweeteners have always occupied a strange space between medicine and food. They are often seen as a cheat, a way to have sweetness without consequence. The wartime use of saccharin was different. It wasn't about dieting or weight loss. It was about pure necessity. It was a chemical substitute embraced because there was no other choice. The widespread adoption of saccharin was an early example of the population accepting a highly processed artificial food additive on a massive scale. This forces us to confront some difficult questions about our food supply. We now have a wide array of artificial sweeteners, each with its own set of chemical properties and potential health concerns. How did a wartime substitute become a multi-billion-dollar industry? At what point does a food stop being a plant or an animal and become a chemical formula, and does it matter? And was the acceptance of saccharin a triumph of scientific innovation or the first step towards a diet disconnected from nature? Number 2, did rationing actually make people healthier? This is one of the most surprising and debated legacies of the war. On the surface, rationing seems like a story of deprivation. The diet was monotonous, bland, and limited. People craved fat, sugar, and meat. Yet, a large body of evidence suggests that for many, particularly the poorest segments of the population, their health improved during the war. Here's why. The rationing system, designed by scientists like Sir Jack Drummond, was based on the nutritional science of the day. It guaranteed that every single person, regardless of income, had access to a baseline of essential nutrients. The diet was low in sugar and fat, and high in fiber and vitamins from the national loaf and the abundance of vegetables. Infant mortality rates declined. The average life expectancy increased. Studies of the period, such as those analyzed in the book Feeding the Nation by the Wellcome Trust Center, show a clear statistical improvement in several key public health markers. Before the war, a large portion of the population suffered from malnutrition due to poverty. Rationing, in effect, eliminated the worst of this by creating a national, equitable food system. It was a massive, unplanned public health experiment. This doesn't mean everyone was happy about it. The middle and upper classes, who were used to a much richer and more varied diet, certainly felt deprived. But for the millions who had previously subsisted on little more than bread, margarine, and tea, the ration book was a guarantee of milk, cheese, and a fair share of the meat available. This nutritional leveling up had profound consequences. The successful implementation of rationing and the visible improvement in public health helped build the case for the post-war creation of the National Health Service in Britain. It proved that the state could play a powerful and effective role in the well-being of its citizens. This startling outcome leaves us with some of the most challenging questions of all. If a diet of scarcity and government control led to better public health outcomes, what does that say about our modern diet of abundance and free choice? Could the principles of rationing fair shares, a focus on nutrients over luxury, and a reduction in sugar and fat be a model for tackling modern epidemics like obesity and diabetes? Or is the loss of choice and pleasure an unacceptable price to pay for public health? Number 1, what is the most important ingredient? After looking at all these recipes, from pies without fruit to cakes without eggs, a single theme emerges. The most important ingredient in the wartime kitchen was not flour or potatoes or even a can of Spam. It was ingenuity. It was the human ability to adapt, to innovate, and to create something out of almost nothing. It was the resilience to face a plate of grated carrots and call it a sandwich filling, or a dish of boiled vegetables and call it a pie. This ingenuity wasn't practiced by famous chefs in fancy restaurants. It was practiced by millions of ordinary women in small kitchens, day after day, for years. They were the unsung logisticians of the home front, managing a complex system of ration points, homegrown vegetables, and foraged foods to keep their families fed. Their handwritten recipe books and the worn-out government pamphlets are testaments to this quiet, daily heroism. The work of social history projects like the Feeding the Nation project, which collected oral histories from people who lived through the period, reveals a story not just of hardship, but of pride, community, and incredible resourcefulness. People shared tips over the garden fence and exchanged recipes in the queue at the butcher's shop. This creativity was a form of resistance. It was a refusal to be defeated by scarcity. Making a cake, even a strange one made with vinegar and water, was an act of defiance. It was a way of maintaining normalcy, of celebrating a birthday, of creating a moment of pleasure in a world defined by conflict and loss. The food writer MFK Fisher wrote beautifully about this, arguing that paying attention to food, even the simplest food, is a way of asserting our humanity. The wartime kitchen, in its own humble way, was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. And so, we are left with the final, most important questions. In our modern world of unprecedented food abundance, have we lost the skill of ingenuity in the kitchen? What would happen to us if we could no longer rely on a global supply chain that brings us every ingredient we desire at any time of year? And if we were faced with the same challenges, would we be able to look at a potato, a few crackers, and a packet of gelatin and see not just a meal, but a victory?